What if the man assigned to catch Israeli spies was an Israeli spy? What if the unit built to destroy Mossad's network inside your country was being run by Mossad? And what if that wasn't the most dangerous infiltration on this list? There is a name that does not appear in any official government record. No personnel file, no trial transcript, no confirmed photograph. He existed inside one of the world's most paranoid intelligence systems, and the only reason we know he existed at all is because the president of the country he was spying on admitted it, publicly, in an interview that shook the intelligence world. He was not a diplomat, not a defector, not a walk-in who offered secrets in exchange for money. He was the director of the unit tasked with finding people exactly like him. But before we get to Tehran, we need to go back further. Because what happened in Iran didn't come from nowhere. It came from a doctrine, a method, a way of thinking about deception that Mossad had been perfecting since the early 1960s. And to understand the doctrine, you need to understand the man who lived it first. His name, in Damascus, was Kamal Amin Thabet. He had grown up, according to every document that existed, in Buenos Aires. He had returned to Syria to reconnect with his roots. He was wealthy, generous, and completely uninterested in political advancement. He threw parties that Syrian generals could not resist attending. He listened more than he spoke. He asked about families, not programs. He remembered birthdays. He sent gifts. In a government full of men competing desperately for status and influence, Kamal Amin Thabet was the one person in the room who seemed to want nothing. That is what made him the most dangerous person in Syria. What no one at those dinner tables knew, what Syrian military intelligence did not discover for 4 years, was that Kamal Amin Thabet had never lived in Buenos Aires. He had been born in Alexandria, Egypt, to a Jewish family. His real name was Eli Cohen. He was Israeli. And everything, the accent, the childhood stories, the Argentine mannerisms, the name, had been constructed in a Tel Aviv training facility before he ever set foot in Damascus. Now, here's the question that should stop you. If you spend 4 years becoming someone else, learning their memories, their habits, their voice, at what point does the person you were start to disappear? Eli Cohen had a wife in Israel, 3 children, a real name, a real history. But in Damascus, he had something his cover identity never accounted for. He had friends. By 1963, one of those friends, a senior Syrian military officer, invited him to inspect fortifications on the Golan Heights, not as a spy with a concealed camera, as a trusted companion who the officer simply wanted to show around. Cohen stood on Syrian military positions and looked at the defensive architecture Israel would need to overcome in any future conflict. He was being given the information. He wasn't extracting it. He wasn't stealing it. It was being offered freely by men who considered him one of their own. That is the first unresolved risk inside this story. Not whether the cover would hold under interrogation, not whether someone would check his documents. But what happens to a man who is genuinely liked, genuinely trusted, genuinely loved by people he is systematically betraying every single day? What does that do to someone over 4 years? There was a second risk. Smaller. Almost invisible. But it was there from the beginning. Every few days from inside his Damascus apartment, Eli Cohen would transmit radio signals back to Tel Aviv. Brief, encrypted, precisely timed to avoid detection. In 1963, the Soviets supplied Egypt and Syria with new radio triangulation equipment. Equipment specifically designed to locate clandestine transmitters. Cohen knew this. Tel Aviv knew this. And yet the transmissions continued because stopping them meant going dark. And going dark meant the intelligence stopped flowing. So he kept transmitting, and the equipment kept scanning. Now, simultaneously, in Cairo, a completely different architecture of deception was being assembled. A man named Wolfgang Lotz had arrived from West Germany. Tall, blonde, athletic, he opened a riding school outside the city that became, very quickly, the social center for Egyptian military officers and the German rocket scientists Nasser had hired to build Egypt's missile program. Lotz was charming. He didn't ask uncomfortable questions about the war. He talked about horses and parties and wine. And these men, far from home, working on classified programs with no one they could truly talk to, started talking to him. What they did not know, what Egyptian intelligence did not discover for 7 years, was the central fact of his entire existence. Wolfgang Lotz was Jewish. The man they were confiding in, at parties celebrating German camaraderie and European solidarity, was the thing their hosts had spent a decade trying to destroy. But here is the detail that will matter later. Lotz made a decision in 1961 that Mossad had not authorized and could not control. He fell in love. Her name was Waltraud. She was German. She was not an operative. She was not part of any legend, and when he told her who he really was, she stayed. Tel Aviv was not pleased, not because love was unprofessional, but because Waltraud was now inside the cover. She attended the parties. She befriended the wives of Egyptian generals. She was, functionally, a second layer of deception, one that Mossad hadn't built, hadn't trained, and couldn't manage. A legend can be constructed. A person in love cannot be fully controlled, and that gap between what an intelligence service plans and what a human being actually does is where most operations eventually break. 3 men, 3 countries, 3 completely different methods, but already, without knowing any of their outcomes, you can see the shape of the problem. Each of them has built something that works, something that is holding, and each of them has created, in the process of building it, a cost that hasn't come due yet. The question isn't whether the covers will be believed, they already are. The question is what gets destroyed in the process of maintaining them. There is an assumption that runs through every espionage story ever told, that the spy is always in control, that the handler back home sees the full picture, that the operation at any given moment can be stopped. All 3 of those assumptions are wrong, and inside these 7 governments, each of them broke, at different moments, in different ways, with different consequences. Let's start with the assumption that broke first. By late 1963, Eli Cohen in Damascus was not simply gathering intelligence. He was shaping events. Syrian generals were consulting him on military appointments. Officers were asking his opinion on policy. Men who commanded divisions were calling him at home to discuss strategy. He had gone from observer to participant. And somewhere in Tel Aviv, the handlers watching his transmissions understood that something had shifted, but they didn't stop it. Because the intelligence was too good, because the access was unprecedented, because when an asset is producing at that level, the institutional pressure to keep them running overrides almost every other consideration. This is the fracture that nobody in the official record discusses. It wasn't the Syrians who pushed Eli Cohen deeper into government, it was his own side. Every request for more detail, every follow-up question transmitted back, required him to ask more, probe more, attend more. And every additional probe was another thread that could be pulled. The cover was working. The cover was also, quietly, expanding beyond its original parameters. And expanded covers are harder to maintain, not because they're less believable, but because there are more surfaces for contradiction to appear. In Cairo, Wolfgang Lotz was facing a different kind of fracture. Not operational, personal. Waltraud, the woman he had brought into the edge of his world, had begun to understand the full weight of what he was doing. Not abstractly, concretely. She watched him leave her evenings with Egyptian military contacts. She sat at dinner tables with men whose programs he was reporting on. She smiled at people whose trust they were both exploiting. And she started asking a question that legends are not built to answer. When does this end? Lotz didn't have an answer, because Mossad hadn't given him one. Deep cover operations don't have scheduled end dates. They run until the intelligence stops being valuable, or until the cover breaks, or until the operative is extracted, usually under circumstances that don't allow for clean departures. Waltraud was not trained for indefinite deployment. She was a person who had agreed to a situation she didn't fully understand, and now understood it too well. And Lotz, who could perform calm in front of Egyptian generals, could not perform it at home. There was a moment, which appears in later accounts, where Lotz considered telling his handler he wanted out. Not because the cover was failing, it wasn't. Because he was watching what the operation was doing to the person next to him, and he didn't have the professional distance to ignore it the way he'd been trained to ignore everything else. He didn't make the call, he stayed. And that decision, to stay, not because the mission required it, but because leaving felt like abandoning someone he'd pulled in, is exactly the kind of human logic that intelligence doctrine has no framework for. Now, Tehran. And here is where Phase 1's central assumption needs to be broken directly. You watched the opening of this story and assumed, reasonably, that the Mossad operative running Iran's anti-Mossad unit was primarily a collector, a man gathering intelligence while pretending to pursue it. That assumption is incomplete. He wasn't just protecting himself, he was actively running interference for other assets. When investigations came close to Mossad's sources inside Iran's nuclear program, inside its Revolutionary Guard, inside its communications infrastructure, his unit was the mechanism that redirected those investigations. He didn't just survive inside the system. He used the system as a shield for an entire network, which means that every agent he protected, every lead he buried, added to the chain of evidence that, if discovered, would trace directly back to him. He was not one man with a false identity. He was the load-bearing wall of Mossad's entire Iranian architecture. And that created a specific, catastrophic risk that no individual cover story carries. A single agent, if caught, burns himself. A network architect, if caught, burns everyone. The people in Tel Aviv who understood what he had become, what he represented, were, by some accounts, terrified. Not of exposure, of the size of the exposure. Because there is a threshold in intelligence operations past which the operation is no longer serving the agency. The agency is serving the operation. And dismantling it or losing it becomes an event with consequences that extend far beyond one man's arrest. There were internal discussions, the kind that don't appear in official histories. Whether to pull him, whether to reduce his footprint, have him run fewer assets, manage less, be less central, whether the architecture he'd built was, at this point, a liability dressed as a capability. The problem, and this is the problem that recurs across all 7 governments in this story, is that the more successful the penetration, the harder it becomes to end it cleanly. You can't extract a man who has become institutionally indispensable without that disappearance itself raising questions. You can't reduce a network quietly when the people inside it have been relying on its protection. You can't tell an operative to be less effective, so the discussions happened, and then, by most accounts, nothing changed, because the intelligence kept flowing. And when intelligence keeps flowing, the pressure to intervene on operational grounds loses to the pressure to keep the pipeline open. He stayed, the network stayed, the risk stayed. Here is the assumption this documentary has been quietly building toward destroying. Every story told so far has been framed, implicitly, as Mossad deceiving its targets. Syria didn't know, Egypt didn't know, Iran didn't know. But now, step back and look at what the evidence actually shows. In Damascus, the Syrian officer who introduced Eli Cohen to the Buenos Aires relative, and who stood there while the alibi was nearly stress-tested, later became one of Cohen's most consistent protectors inside the Syrian establishment. After Cohen's arrest, this officer was among those investigated for complicity. He was cleared. But the question was never fully answered. Did he protect Cohen because he was deceived, or because at some level he had decided not to look? In Egypt, the German rocket scientists who confided in Wolfgang Lotz, at least 2 of them, according to later West German intelligence assessments, had significant doubts about him by 1964. They didn't report those doubts. Not because they were afraid, because reporting doubts inside Nasser's Egypt meant becoming part of an investigation you couldn't control. It was safer to be wrong about a friend than to be right about a spy. So they chose not to know. In Iran, the revelation that came out of Ahmadinejad's 2024 interview was not simply that a Mossad agent ran the anti-Mossad unit. It was that multiple senior officials had, at various points, received information that suggested something was wrong with that unit. And those reports had been reviewed and filed, and not acted on. Not because the officials were corrupt, not because they were paid, because the alternative, that the unit they had built, the people they had vetted, the apparatus they had trusted, had been compromised from the top, was an institutional truth too catastrophic to absorb. So here is the reframe. Mossad did not succeed in 7 governments because its deceptions were perfect. It succeeded because the targets, at critical moments, chose the comfortable version of reality over the accurate one. The deceptions worked not because they were invisible, but because seeing them was too costly. And that changes everything about what you thought you understood going into the second half of this story. Because if the targets sometimes knew, or half knew, or suspected, and chose silence, then the question is no longer just, how did Mossad get inside? The question is, what did those governments do with the knowledge that they had been entered? And the answer to that question is darker than any false identity. Because it means the damage wasn't only done by the agents. Some of it was done by the people who decided quietly, institutionally, for reasons of survival, not to stop them. There is a moment in every long-running operation where the deception stops feeling like a performance, not because the danger has passed, not because the cover is secure, but because the operative has been doing it long enough that the lie has developed its own momentum. It moves without being pushed. It answers questions before they're asked. It makes friends on its own. That moment is not a victory. It is the most dangerous point in the entire operation, because when a cover starts running itself, the operative stops watching it. Damascus, early 1964. Eli Cohen had been Kamal Amin Thabet for nearly 3 years. He had stopped rehearsing his backstory before social engagements. He had stopped mentally cataloging which Syrian official knew which version of which story. He moved through Damascus the way a man moves through his own city, not because he was careless, but because 3 years of survival had created a kind of operational confidence that felt, from the inside, like mastery. It was not mastery. It was accumulated risk wearing the face of mastery. In January 1964, he made a transmission that ran longer than protocol permitted. Not significantly longer. Minutes, not hours. But the new Soviet triangulation equipment that had been quietly distributed to Syrian signals intelligence didn't need hours. It needed patterns. It needed repetition. It needed a transmitter that appeared in the same location more than once. He had been transmitting from the same apartment for 3 years. The equipment was new, the apartment was not. Tel Aviv received the transmission. They received all of them. And somewhere in the chain between the handler and the operational director, someone looked at the transmission log and noticed the duration. A note was made. A follow-up was drafted. It was not sent with urgency. Because the intelligence in that transmission, details about Syrian Air Force reorganization and troop movements in the Golan, was exactly what they needed. And when intelligence is exactly what you need, the instinct to protect the source overrides the instinct to protect the person. The follow-up, when it came, asked for clarification on the troop movements. It did not say, shorten your transmissions. It did not say, change location. It said, can you confirm the regiment designation? He confirmed it, with another transmission, from the same apartment. Now, Cairo, the same window of time. Wolfgang Lotz had, by early 1964, successfully identified the locations of 3 Egyptian missile sites and passed the identities of several German scientists involved in the program back to Tel Aviv. Some of those scientists had received letter bombs, packages that arrived at Egyptian addresses and detonated on opening. Lotz knew about the letter bomb campaign. He had, in some cases, provided the addresses. And then he had to sit across from the surviving colleagues of those scientists at dinner parties. He had to express horror. He had to speculate alongside men who were now frightened for their own lives about who could have done it. There was one specific evening, where a German scientist looked at Lotz across the table and said quietly that he was thinking of leaving Egypt, that the work no longer felt safe, that something about the situation felt wrong in a way he couldn't name. Lotz told him to stay, that it would settle down, that Egypt needed them and would protect them. The scientist stayed. He was not targeted again, he was not harmed, but Lotz had, in that moment, actively worked against the safety of a man who trusted him, to preserve a cover that the man's departure might complicate. He didn't agonize over it publicly. He didn't record it as a moral crisis. He went home and told Waltraud that the evening had gone well. Waltraud had stopped asking when it would end. She had started asking a different question, one that Lotz found harder to deflect. She asked whether the people they were spending time with knew, on some level, that something was wrong. Not about him specifically, about the situation, about the dynamic. She said it felt sometimes like everyone at those parties was performing for everyone else. Like the warmth was real, but the trust wasn't. Like they were all, in their own ways, pretending. Lotz told her she was imagining it. He wasn't sure he believed himself. Back to Tehran, later. A different era, the same logic. The operative running Iran's anti-Mossad unit had, by a certain point, accumulated enough institutional authority that he was being consulted on personnel decisions across multiple departments of the intelligence ministry. He had not sought this expansion. It had come to him, the natural gravity of a man who appears competent and trustworthy in an environment where both qualities are rare. And one day, a subordinate brought him a file. The file contained surveillance reports on a mid-level official in Iran's nuclear program. The reports had been compiled by a different unit, one that didn't report to him. and they suggested, with moderate confidence, that the official had made contact with a foreign national whose background didn't fully check out. The subordinate wanted to know whether to escalate. The operative looked at the file. The mid-level official was not one of his assets. He didn't know the man, he had no operational reason to protect him, but escalating the file meant a formal investigation. A formal investigation meant other units becoming active. Other units becoming active in this particular corridor of the nuclear program meant increased scrutiny in exactly the area where Mossad's actual assets were embedded. He told the subordinate the file was thin, that the foreign national contact was probably commercial, that they should monitor passively and not escalate without harder evidence. The subordinate accepted this, filed the report accordingly. The mid-level official was never formally investigated. He was also, as far as any available record shows, not a Mossad asset. The operative had suppressed a legitimate lead to protect a network, based on a proximity calculation that turned out to be unnecessary. He had created a false negative in Iran's security record to solve a problem that didn't exist. And here is what that means, operationally. It means that somewhere in Iran's intelligence archives, there is a suppressed report on a man who may have been entirely innocent. And if that suppression is ever reviewed, if anyone ever looks at the pattern of which files were closed and which were escalated during his tenure, the shape of his interference becomes visible. Not through what he did, through what he didn't do. This is the false release moment that every long-running operation eventually produces, the moment where everything appears stable, where the cover is holding, the network is intact, the intelligence is flowing, and the immediate threat has been managed. It feels like control. It is actually the moment when the accumulated weight of every previous decision, every suppressed file, every extended transmission, every dinner party attended under a false name, who has reached a mass that no single intervention can reduce. In Damascus, Cohen received word from Tel Aviv that they were pleased with his recent intelligence, that his access was extraordinary, that they were proud of what he had built. He read the message in his apartment. He had a photograph of his wife and children in Tel Aviv that he was not supposed to keep. He kept it anyway, hidden inside a book he knew no Syrian visitor would open. He looked at the photograph for a moment. Then he sat down at the transmitter. He had a response to send and questions to answer, and the equipment in the room made a specific sound when it warmed up. A sound he'd heard hundreds of times, and he didn't think anymore about what it would mean if someone else was listening for that sound. He sent the transmission. He went to bed. 3 weeks later, Syrian signals intelligence had confirmed the location, but Eli Cohen didn't know that yet. And so he woke up the next morning as Kamal Amin Thabet, as he had every morning for 3 years, and went to have breakfast with a Syrian general who considered him a close friend. The cover was intact. The trap had already closed. He just hadn't felt it yet. The fallout from a deep cover operation does not begin at the moment of arrest. It begins earlier, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. It begins the moment the operative makes the first decision they know is wrong, and makes it anyway because the alternative is worse. Everything after that is just the distance between the mistake and its consequence. Damascus, January 1965. Syrian signals intelligence had been narrowing the triangulation for weeks. They had a neighborhood, then a street, then a building. They did not move immediately. And this is the detail that matters, because it tells you something about how the fallout actually works. They waited, not because they were unsure, because they wanted to understand the network before they removed the node. They wanted to know who he had spoken to, which generals had attended his parties, which officers had walked him through the Golan. So, while Eli Cohen continued transmitting, continued attending dinners, continued being Kamal Amin Thabet, Syrian intelligence was building a second operation around him, using him as the center of an investigation into their own government. The deception had become a tool for the people being deceived. When they entered his apartment on January 18, 1965, they found him mid-transmission. The radio was on. The encoded message was half sent. He did not run. There was nowhere to run. He had been Kamal Amin Thabet for 4 years, and Kamal Amin Thabet had no escape route because Kamal Amin Thabet had never needed one. Eli Cohen had been so good at being someone else that he had not maintained the infrastructure of being himself. The Syrian government's response was not only punitive, it was strategic. They arrested every general who had attended his parties, every officer who had shown him military installations. every official whose name appeared in his correspondence. Some were executed. Some were imprisoned. Some had their careers ended quietly. The investigation reached into the Syrian High Command and left permanent damage, not because it found widespread complicity, but because it couldn't rule it out. And in a government built on loyalty tests and mutual suspicion, the inability to rule out complicity is functionally the same as finding it. Eli Cohen didn't just gather intelligence from Syria's government. His arrest restructured it. That restructuring was not what Tel Aviv had intended. It was a consequence, a direct consequence of the decision to keep him transmitting past safe parameters from the same location for too long. The intelligence was valuable. The aftermath created a Syrian military establishment that was, for years, more internally suspicious, more cautious, and harder to penetrate than it had been before Cohen arrived. The operation succeeded, and in succeeding, it made the next operation significantly harder. In Cairo, the fallout arrived differently. Wolfgang Lotz and Waltraud were arrested in February 1965, the same month, the same window, as Cohen, as part of a broader sweep triggered by West German and Egyptian counterintelligence cooperation. The evidence was forensic: radio equipment, coded materials, the connection to the letter bomb campaign. Waltraud was not a trained operative. She had no preparation for interrogation. She had no legend to retreat into. She had only the truth, which was that she had known and stayed and said nothing. Egyptian prosecutors used her presence in the operation not to understand the intelligence damage, but to maximize the political embarrassment. A German woman, married to a German man, both working for Israel inside Nasser's Egypt. It was a propaganda gift, and they used it fully. Lotz was sentenced to life imprisonment. Waltraud received a shorter sentence. They were released in 1968 as part of a prisoner exchange following the Six-Day War, the very war that the intelligence Lotz gathered had helped Israel prepare for. He returned to a country that received him quietly. There were no public celebrations. Israel had its reasons for discretion, reasons that had more to do with ongoing operations than with modesty. Lotz wrote a memoir, gave some interviews, and spent the rest of his life in a specific kind of exile that has no geographic definition, the exile of a person whose most formative years happened under a name that wasn't theirs, in a life that wasn't real, with consequences that were. He and Waltraud eventually separated. The thing that had held them together, the shared secret, the shared danger, had no function in ordinary life. And ordinary life was all that remained. Tehran, the longer fallout. The operative who ran Iran's anti-Mossad unit did not go down in a single dramatic arrest. What the public record shows in fragments, through Ahmadinejad's 2024 disclosures and subsequent Iranian intelligence ministry statements, is a collapse that happened in stages. First, anomalies. Patterns in closed investigations that didn't match the evidence. Files that had been assessed as low priority that, in retrospect, should have escalated. Then, internal reviews. Quiet ones. The kind that don't get announced because announcing them means admitting the scope of what you're reviewing. Then, and this is the part that carries the longest consequence, the realization that the damage was not contained to intelligence collection. The operative had not just passed information to Israel. He had shaped Iran's understanding of its own security environment for years. The threat assessments his unit produced, the agents they cleared, the networks they assessed as inactive, the vulnerabilities they classified as low priority. All of it had been filtered through a man whose institutional loyalty was to someone else. Which means Iran's intelligence apparatus, for a period that has never been fully defined, was operating on a map of its own security landscape that had been quietly, methodically redrawn by the people it was trying to locate. This is the long-term strategic consequence that goes beyond any single arrest or any single stolen document. When you place an agent inside a government's intelligence architecture at a senior enough level, you don't just take information out. You put misinformation in. And misinformation at that level doesn't expire when the agent is discovered. It stays embedded in the institutional record, in the decisions that were made based on his assessments, in the careers of people he cleared or flagged, in the operations that were launched or canceled on his recommendation. Discovery doesn't undo it. It only reveals the size of the problem. And the size, once Iran began to understand it, was the reason Ahmadinejad's statement landed the way it did. He wasn't announcing a past failure. He was warning about a present condition. Those two sentences carry a weight that most intelligence postmortems never acknowledge. When a foreign operative is discovered inside your government, the instinct is to frame it as a closed chapter. You found him. You removed him. The breach is sealed. The story is over. But that framing is a comfort the evidence does not support. The infiltration hadn't ended when the operative was identified, because the operative was not the infiltration. He was the mechanism of it. The infiltration itself lived in everything he had touched, every report he had written, every case he had closed, every name he had cleared, every threat he had assessed as manageable. All of that remained. All of that was now suspect. And suspicion at that scale doesn't function like a surgical problem you can isolate and remove. It functions like contamination. It spreads backward through time. Every decision made during his tenure now required re-examination. Every asset he had vouched for needed revetting. Every operation that had been approved based on his unit's assessments needed to be reviewed against the possibility that the assessment itself had been shaped by someone whose interests ran in the opposite direction. Because you cannot unbuild an intelligence architecture around a compromised foundation simply by removing the person who compromised it. This is the truth that governments learn slowly and expensively. The foundation doesn't become stable again just because the person who destabilized it is gone. The instability is now structural. It lives in the institutional record, in the files, in the chain of decisions that referenced his work, built on his conclusions, trusted his clearances. Removing him doesn't repair that. It only makes the full dimension of the damage visible, which is, in some ways, worse, because now you can see exactly how far it goes and exactly how long it will take to address it, and you have to do all of that while the apparatus is still expected to function. You have to go back, review everything, retest every assumption, reopen every closed file. Each of those steps requires people, time, and resources pulled away from active operations. Each review triggers its own internal suspicion: who else might have known, who else might have been complicit, who can be trusted to conduct the review itself. The process of cleaning a compromised institution becomes, almost immediately, an operation that consumes the institution from the inside. Personnel frees up. Lateral communication stops. Officers who once shared information freely begin treating their own colleagues as potential variables in an equation they don't fully understand. The culture of operational trust, which is the actual engine of any functioning intelligence service, corrodes, and in doing that, you paralyze the apparatus you're trying to protect. This is the design, whether Mossad intended it consciously or not. The operative's greatest value was never purely informational. Any competent asset can steal documents. What this operative did was something architecturally more damaging. He made Iran's intelligence service uncertain about itself. And an intelligence service that is uncertain about itself is not a functioning intelligence service. It is an institution performing the motions of function while quietly losing the capacity to act. Paranoia replaces analysis. Process replaces judgment. Every conclusion becomes provisional. Every source becomes questionable. The agency doesn't just stop trusting outsiders, it stops trusting itself. Mossad's greatest achievement in Iran was not the intelligence it extracted. It was the institutional paralysis that came after the extraction ended. The 100,000 documents stolen in 2018 were significant. The assassinated scientists were significant. The sabotaged centrifuges were significant. But all of those were events with beginnings and endings. Iran could absorb them, respond to them, rebuild around them. What it could not easily rebuild around was the knowledge that its own counterintelligence unit, the unit specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of damage, had been the instrument of it. That the wall had a door in it, that the door had been opened for years, and that the person holding the key had been chosen, vetted, trusted, and promoted by the institution itself. That knowledge doesn't fade when the operative is gone. It becomes a permanent feature of how the institution understands its own vulnerability. And institutions that are permanently uncertain of their own integrity do not project strength. They project caution dressed as strength, which, to any adversary watching closely, looks exactly like what it is. Mossad did not just penetrate Iran's government. It left something behind when it withdrew. Not an agent, not a network, a doubt. And that doubt, quiet, sourceless, institutional, is still doing work. Eli Cohen's body remained in Syria for 54 years. His wife Nadia raised their 3 children alone. I petitioned every Israeli government for decades and never remarried. She spent more of her adult life as the widow of a man the state would not officially confirm was dead than she had spent as his wife. He had chosen the mission. She had not. The cost was distributed unequally, as it always is. Jonathan Pollard, whose recruitment by Israeli intelligence represented Mossad's most strategically sensitive penetration of a supposed ally, died in Jerusalem in December 2024. He had served 30 years in a U.S. federal prison. His health had deteriorated significantly in custody. He arrived in Israel upon his release in 2015 to a reception that Israeli officials were careful not to make too public, because the political cost of celebrating a man who had committed espionage against America's own intelligence services was one that even the closest of alliances could not comfortably absorb. He had been used. He had known he was being used. He had told himself it was something else. That gap between what an operation is and what the person inside it believes it to be is where the personal cost lives, not in the prison sentence. In the moment you understand fully that the story you told yourself was the deepest deception of all. 7 governments, decades of operations, intelligence that shaped wars, restructured governments, and changed the map of the Middle East. And underneath all of it, the same recurring truth. The cover held, the network ran, the intelligence flowed, and almost everyone who made that possible paid a price that the intelligence itself never recorded. Not because the operations failed, because they worked. If any part of this story felt like it was about institutions and governments, go back and look at the people. The wife in Tel Aviv who kept a photograph on her wall for 54 years, the woman in Cairo who stayed when she should have left, because love doesn't come with a security clearance. The man in Tehran whose name we still don't know, whose outcome is still unconfirmed, who may or may not have made it out. The analyst in Washington who convinced himself that loyalty to one country wasn't betrayal of another, and spent 30 years understanding that it was. History records the operations. It does not record what the operations cost the people who ran them. That part you have to look for.